Hello, my name is Jesse Robinson. I'm going to be showing you my genogram, my pedigree of my family. I guess first I'll start with my mother's parents. So my grandfather was Irish as well as English. His father taught at A&M, and then he became part of the head Department of Agriculture and actually focused on meat grading. A very interesting past. So my grandfather, Lloyd Byron Burke, he was actually a hand surgeon, and he worked at Arlington. He helped to open up the Arlington Hospital in Washington, outside of Washington D.C. Once he got a little older, he was a big part of the community around Locust Grove, and he helped out with the Optimist Club, and he actually has a baseball field dedicated in his name. My grandmother was Irish, English, Scottish, and Welsh, and her family dates back from Scotland, back from the Scotland and Scottish and English War, and where they fled and came and settled in South Carolina in the 1700s. She had an art degree, and that played a big role in my mother's passion for art, and which led down to my passion for art as well. They had 6 children, or actually 8 children. 2 of them died, and so I had 6 aunts and uncles from that side of the family. And my aunts and uncles on that side of the family played a huge role in who I am today, because of all of my cousins that came from that family, and every time we had a family get together with very regularly, we ended up just having a huge family get together. So it just played a big part of myself and seeing family and knowing the family roles. So on my father's side over here, my grandfather, every time we got to see him, he actually was a World War II veteran that was part of the Battle of the Bulge, and it was the biggest part of his life. He spoke about his war and his patriotism for our country, and that flowed down through the generations as well. He met my grandmother, who was Czechoslovakian and devout Catholic, when he was over in Europe for the war, and they came back together. My grandmother was probably, out of everyone, the only one that introduced me to any kind of religion, so that plays a big role with my spiritualism and myself today. They had 3 kids, and they raised those kids in the Bronx, New York City, and both my mother and my father were in 2 huge cities during the desegregation time, and so they told me a lot of stories about all of that. My mother and my father both were hippies, and they traveled cross country, and that's eventually how they got to meet each other. My father was in the Vietnam War, and he also was a surfer in Puerto Rico, and then he was a botanist that led down to some of my passions. My mother protested the Vietnam War and was in California in the late 60s and early 70s, and she was actually recognized for a lot of her artwork at that time. They had my sister and myself in the mountains of North Carolina where they met, and my sister and her husband had a few different children. Her first son actually died from APKRD, and so I kind of started to learn a lot about the loss of a child and genetics and things like that once that happened. They adopted a daughter, and then they also had 2 in vitro fertilization sons. Myself, from my stories of my father and my mother, I traveled cross country, and when I was 18 and lived in California, became a marine biologist and a massage therapist. I met my girlfriend in Hawaii, and we had a son, Ezra, and my dog, Xander. And Xander played a big role in how I view death and grief, and I think about that when I see a lot of things go on with my work here as an RN. So this is my family genome, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.